Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Linton, and today we're going to be looking at the impact of childhood domestic violence on future arrests. As some general background introduction for this topic, the victim offender cycle, which is a criminological phenomenon informed by other theories, goes by a few other names, such as the cycle of violence hypothesis, the victim offender overlap, and the victim offender cycle. But it basically is the idea that a child's exposure to different forms of violence or criminality has the potential to result in negative physical, mental, and behavioral outcomes, which therefore raises their likelihood of an individual's criminality later on in life. Essentially, this hypothesis attempts to explain and justify the potential coexistence of an individual's simultaneous victimization and offending, while also considering the system's historical scrutiny of offenders, furthermore disregarding the impacts of their own victimization. We'll never really know the true victimization rates for crime in general, yet alone domestic violence, and this is on account of victimization rates being influenced by societal mistrust of police, the safety and fear of reprisal, and the various different victimization stigmas of reporting. Between the period of 2016 and 2020, it was found there was a 40% increase in violent victimizations, and in 2017, the Department of Justice reported that 56% of all violent victimizations consisted of domestic violence cases. In the American Journal of Emergency Medicine, it was found that lack of DV reporting due to the coronavirus and the lack of in-person communication increased the domestic violence rates anywhere from 25 to 33%. To clarify, this paper cannot and does not set out to study the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the strain that people endured. However, it's simply to say that due to the amount of prior literature regarding general strain theory, the impacts of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic have the potential to increase crime rates in the future on account of juvenile exposure to victimizations, especially on the tail end of a global post-coronavirus quarantine period, where limited external societal interaction was present. The potential increased exposure of various types of crimes, especially domestic violence experienced within the home, upon children is significant and has the potential to result in criminal tendencies later on in life. This later trend towards criminality warrants further investigation on account of both a crime prevention perspective, but also to ensure the child's short-term and long-term well-being. For a little bit of a deeper dive into the prior literature surrounding this topic, the victim offender cycle is a phenomenon informed by various different theories that observes an individual's likelihood of later criminality dependent on their prior victimization. One of the main assumptions from the victim offender cycle is that one's criminal involvement, either as a victim or as an offender, increases one's offending and victimization risk. And the long-term impacts from this hypothesis have the potential to be significant on later crime rates and general wellness, and throughout the combination of a collective approach, warrant further investigation. Akers in 1997, in his study surrounding social learning and deviant behavior, found that those under the age of 8 were more likely to be influenced by their parents, whereas those above the age of 8, specifically adolescents, were more likely to be influenced by their peers. So, when looking at children exposed to domestic violence within the 2020 and 2021 pandemic, it can be assumed that children below the age of 8 were more likely to be impacted developmentally as a result of accepting the attitudes towards violence modeled by their parents. In terms of additional literature, there's been studies looking at the relationship between different forms of violence and individuals' acceptance of that violence, as well as a distinct relationship between a child's exposure to domestic violence, such as child abuse, and their development of internal and external self-control measures and behavior problems. Internal meaning depression and anxiety, external meaning delinquency and aggression. Moreover, children exposed to domestic violence were more likely to have a higher rate of either one or both of these types of behavior problems. Where some people would use delinquency as a way to exert control after their abuse, others might use it as a way to repress negative emotions in them. It's also been found that those who engage in offending are less likely to have serious perceptions of their own offending unless they consider their parents' perception of their child's offending. In terms of the theory used to study this topic, it is general strain theory, which looks at the impact that different types of strain have upon one's later propensity for criminal behavior. These different types of strain that can be encountered include a failure to achieve personal goals, the loss of positive stimuli, or the addition of negative stimuli. These various forms of strain are expected to produce negative emotions such as anger, depression, and fear, which are commonly eased by committing crime. While there's no guarantee that someone will commit crime, they are more likely to if they have a significant amount of perceived and unjust strain placed upon them without any mitigating factors. The research designed for this study looks at individual level longitudinal design. Basically, given the increase in domestically violent offending during the coronavirus pandemic, it's important to test the impact of those crimes upon families, as opposed to testing the level of strain, not just to monitor the functioning of the child affected, but also to provide specific support and assistance for recovery purposes. With this in mind, the targeted study for the research design looks at families within the Memphis area who, during the coronavirus quarantine period, which we are defining as March 2020 to December 2021, are on police record for a child experiencing firsthand any form of DV within their primary household. As is the nature of longitudinal studies, subjects will be observed over multiple time periods, in this instance, 3 different time periods. These time periods will be the date of first contact between the individuals, which is in 2023, and then on 2 different occasions with a 5-year interval between them, so 2028 and 2033. The goal of this study is to look at the short-term and long-term effects of DV on children, so while the parents are important for context, the main focus will surround the child and their experiences. While the independent variable of experiencing some form of DV is able to be controlled through statistical manipulation, the consideration of any form of victimization against a respective child will be included into the analysis in order to look at the interpersonal effects and their long-term impacts. So the research question for this study was, does experiencing some form of domestic violence as a child increase their likelihood of arrest in later life? Their hypothesis was for testing the victim-offender cycle. So a child's exposure to domestic violence increases their likelihood of later police arrest. In terms of looking at data, the idea was to use both primary and secondary data, looking at police reports and a mixed method study with the assistance of previously validated childhood trauma questionnaire, short form, and the adverse childhood experiences questionnaires, which look at individual experiences throughout their childhood up until the point of surveying. While both of these surveys look at experiences during childhood, questions can be adapted to suit the quarantine timeframe by asking instead if the individual experienced domestic violence victimization between the dates of March 2020 and December 2021, instead of if they experienced it during their childhood at all. This study will look at families who are involved in DV in some form or another per the Memphis Police Department reports during these dates. The variables being studied are the dependent variable of later arrest in life, so on account of their prior victimization. This would be measured through either no arrest record being represented by 0 or an arrest record being represented by 1. In terms of the independent variable, it would be looking at the victimization of the child. However, since all kinds of victimization are being studied, it would be collapsed, like a collapsed variable, meaning that all scores across the factor are summed together to get one average victimization scores. These are consisting of emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, and emotional neglect. In terms of the different control variables, there are quite a few, and the specific measurements are listed below. However, these control variables specifically are race, average yearly income, strain, anger, marital status, education, self-control levels, negative mental health, risky behavior, peer delinquency, and prior childhood maltreatment. Without getting too fancy into it, the specific statistical analysis that I'll be using is a logistic regression, specifically a multiple regression with a dummy dependent variable. Again, if you'd like to read a little more, everything is on this page. That brings us to policy implications. It's expected that those children who've experienced child maltreatment will have different thoughts, feelings, and behaviors on account of an increased anxiety, PTSD symptoms, emotional regulation, and depression. The proposed study expects a significant increase in childhood and adolescent mental health issues, especially with regard to anxiety, depression, and regulating emotions such as self-control, aggression, and delinquency. We expect differences in gender, with regard to girls experiencing an internalization of emotions, yet partaking in risky behaviors, whereas boys are either expected to act out violently towards others as a way to regulate their emotions, i.e. self-control, aggression, delinquency, or either shut down and exhibit extreme antisocial factors. Symptoms of depression, anxiety, and issues with regarding regulating emotions are expected. Namely, we also expect there to be a difference in race, with more arrest rates expected with minority children, on account of their increased interactions with police, either through the schooling system or through police patrols on the street. In Tennessee, there are a few different places that children who've experienced child maltreatment can go and different forms of education that they can find. The Tennessee Department of Health and the Memphis Child Advocacy Center are two that I've referenced on this page, and you can pause and read here if you would like to. In terms of improvements for the future, if I was to set up an ideal study that would fully test the effect that the pandemic had upon public strain, it would look at strains felt by children, such as through family death, maltreatment, and loss of schooling opportunities, and hence the loss of social connection. Moreover, the study would not be isolated to only studying general strain theory, but also by taking an integrated approach and also incorporating social learning theory. Since the conclusion of the official COVID period, it's been found that the school didn't really have anything in place to help try and get in contact with children, especially if these children did not have access to forms of technological communication, such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams. And it was also found that this was a problem as teachers could not actually monitor the effects of domestic violence and how kids were doing at home. To make recommendations for the future, the idea would be to provide the student adequate technological resources such as computer that have video communication abilities to help with both their learning and their levels of safety. However, given the current American budget, this is not applicable, and so more funding should be put into the education system. Below are the different limitations for this study. If this is something that interests you, I would recommend pausing and reading. To conclude, I just want to emphasize the influence that coronavirus had upon the domestic violence rates within not just the United States, but Memphis specifically. When looking at child maltreatment through the lens of general strain theory, it is going to be found that on account of the domestic violence victimizations during the isolation period, there is more likely to be an increase in arrests on account of these victimizations in the future. Unfortunately, on account of the different stresses that came from the pandemic, such as the household income, their parents' marital status, strain levels, peer delinquency levels, the levels of education, and the risky behavior choices that have the potential to, in the future, impact one's likelihood of offending, it's more likely that that one's childhood victimization during the COVID period is likely to continue the cycle of violence long into the future.